The sky over the territory had been the color of a bruise since dawn, and by the time the stagecoach reached the last stretch of open plain, that bruise had darkened into something the driver didn't like the look of at all. Sat pressed against the cold window glass, watching the grass bend flat under a wind that hadn't existed an hour ago, and she understood, the way a body understands weather before the mind catches up, that they were riding straight into trouble. She was not supposed to be on this coach. The letter sewn into the lining of her coat pocket said in her father's careful hand, and every mile that passed beneath the wheels pulled her further from the truth of who she was and deeper into the shape of who she was pretending to be. 2 nights ago, her sister had climbed out a window with a drifter named Sam and never looked back, not at their father's collapsing face, not at the ruin she left steaming behind her like a horse run too hard, not at the debt that now had no bride to settle it. Still didn't know the particulars of that debt, only that it was old and heavy and tied to a name, Boone, that her father spoke the way other men spoke of whether they couldn't outrun. Someone has to go, her mother had said, not unkindly but with the flat certainty of a woman who had already decided. You have her coloring, you have her hands. No one out there has laid eyes on either of you. So had put on her sister's name like a borrowed coat, one that didn't quite fit through the shoulders, and boarded a stagecoach bound for a rancher she had never met, to become a wife she had never agreed to be. The coach lurched. Snow had begun sifting down in earnest now, fine as flour at first, then thickening, and the driver's voice came muffled through the wood and canvas, shouting something to the horses that couldn't make out over the wind. She pulled her shawl and pressed her palm flat against her chest, where her heart was going faster than the miles could account for. She tried to picture him. Boone. A rancher, 30 years old, her father had said, as though age were the only fact worth offering. She had imagined, at various points along the journey, a hard-faced man with her father's kind of fear behind his eyes, a man who collected debts the way other men collected grudges. She had not let herself imagine anything gentler than that, because gentleness would have made this harder to bear. The axle broke without warning, a crack like a rifle shot, and then the whole coach tilted and shuddered to a stop at an angle that sent trunk sliding into her shins. Outside, the driver swore, low and furious, at wood and weather both. "Can't fix her out here, miss," he called back, already half buried in white by the time she pushed the door open against the wind. "Storm's coming down too fast. I'll take the horses on to the ranch house, send a wagon back for you and the trunk. You'll be all right to wait." "Wait where?" The wind tore the words half out of her mouth. "There's a windbreak yonder by that stand of pine. Best I can offer, miss. I'm sorry for it." And then he was gone, swallowed into the churning gray with both horses, leaving her alone on a road she didn't know, in a storm that had teeth now, wearing a name that wasn't hers. Had grown up on a farm. She knew in the clear-headed part of her mind that fear hadn't yet reached, that standing still in a blizzard was its own kind of dying. So she walked. The wind came at her sideways, cruel and searching, finding every gap in her coat, and the cold worked into her boots until her feet stopped being feet at all and became two aching, distant weights she had to drag forward. The world had gone the color of nothing, no sky, no ground, no horizon, just a churning white silence broken only by her own ragged breath and the low, constant moan of the wind through unseen grass. She thought of, warm somewhere with her drifter, and felt something close to hatred, and then let it go because there wasn't room in her chest for both fear and fury at once. She thought she saw a shape. At first she took it for a trick of the storm, the mind conjuring rescue out of desperation, but the shape held and grew, resolving slowly into a horse and rider cutting a dark line through all that white. She tried to call out and found her voice had gone, stolen by cold or fear or both, and her legs, finally, betrayed her. The ground came up sideways. The last thing she registered with any clarity was the sound of hooves breaking into a run. Boone had been checking the north fence line since first light, driven by the old, bone-deep instinct that told a rancher when weather was about to turn mean, and he'd been 3/4 of the way back to the house when he saw something dark against the snow that had no business being there. He didn't think. He never did. In moments like this, thinking was for after, for the long nights when a man lay awake turning over what he might have done differently. He put his heels to the horse. She was half buried by the time he reached her lips gone the color of ash, her hair, pale gold even under a crust of snow, spilled loose from its pins across her shoulder. He didn't know her, had never laid eyes on her in his life, but something in him moved anyway, some old current beneath conscious thought, and he was off the horse and down on his knees in the snow before he decided to be. "Easy," he said to no one, to himself, to the woman who couldn't hear him. He stripped his own coat and wrapped her in it, gathered her up against his chest. She weighed almost nothing, or the fear in him made her weigh nothing, and got them both back onto the horse, her head tucked beneath his jaw, her breath a faint, warm proof of life against his throat. He rode for the house harder than he'd ridden in years, the storm screaming past them both, his mind empty of everything except the single, driving need to get her somewhere warm before the cold finished what it had started. The lights of the ranch house rose up out of the white like something imagined, and there were shapes at the gate already, townsfolk, gathered despite the weather, drawn by the news that had traveled ahead of the storm. "She's here. The girl, Boone's bride." Voices lifted through the wind as he came through the gate, relief and welcome tangled together. "There she is, Mrs. Boone's arrived at last." Surfaced from the gray for just a moment, dragged up out of the cold by warmth and noise and the solid, steady thunder of a heartbeat beneath her ear. She heard the name before she understood it was meant for her. Mrs. Boone. She meant to correct them. Some fragment of her mind reached for the words, for her own name, for the truth, but her throat only managed a small, broken sound, and the gathered townsfolk took it in their eagerness and relief for an answer. The door of the ranch house opened, spilling firelight into the storm, and was carried across the threshold into a name that was not hers, a marriage she had not chosen, and a life that had already begun closing quietly, irreversibly, around her before she'd so much as opened her eyes. Warmth reached before thought did, a deep, wood-smoke-scented heat that pressed against her skin like a hand, coaxing her up out of the gray place she'd been floating in. She surfaced slowly, the way a diver surfaces, careful of the distance, and opened her eyes to a ceiling of rough-hewn beams she had never seen before in her life. For a long moment she simply lay there, what she could. Quilts, heavy and hand-stitched, tucked to her chin. A fire ticking low in a stone hearth across the room. A nightgown against her skin that was not her own, soft with years of washing, smelling faintly of cedar and someone else's soap. She turned her head and caught her reflection in a cracked mirror above a washstand, pale, hollow-eyed, her hair loosed from its pins and dried into a wild gold tangle, and for one disoriented breath she didn't recognize the woman looking back. Then memory came for her all at once, the way the storm had, the broken axle, the walking, the horse cutting through white, the gate, the voices. Mrs. Boone. She sat up too fast and the room tilted. "Easy." The voice came from the doorway, low and unhurried, and his head snapped toward it. He stood with one shoulder against the frame, dressed plain, a chambray shirt rolled to the forearm, dark trousers, boots that had seen every kind of weather, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not quite tenderness, not quite caution. Something careful, held at a distance, the way a man might watch a spooked animal he didn't want to startle further. "You've been asleep the better part of a day," he said. "Doc came through in the storm, said you'd likely wake with your wits about you, and he was right, it seems." His mouth was dry as chalk. Where she stopped, started again. "Who?" "Boone." He said it plainly, like a man introducing himself for the first time, which, in every way that mattered, he was. "This is my house, my land." A pause, and something flickered behind his eyes before he added, quieter, "Our house now, I suppose, if the preacher's word and your father's letter carry the weight they're meant to." The floor seemed to drop away beneath her. Our house. She opened her mouth to tell him. The truth was right there. 3 words, I am not, but the memory of the gate rushed back on her. The townsfolk crowding close with their lanterns and their relief. The name already spoken and answered before she'd had the chance to refuse it. To correct him now, in this quiet room, with him standing there so plainly grateful she'd lived through the night, felt like pulling a support beam out from under a house already built. I don't remember much, she said instead, which was not quite a lie. The storm being carried. You were near frozen through when I found you on the North Road. He came a step further into the room, not close, careful to leave the distance between them intact. Another hour out there, and I don't believe you'd have made it to tell me your own name. My own name. The words landed with a weight he couldn't have intended. Looked down at the quilt, at her own pale hands against it, and said nothing at all, and let the silence stand in for a confession she didn't have the courage to make. He didn't press her. That more than anything unsettled her. She had braced herself, somewhere on that long cold road, for a hard man. A man collecting on an old debt the way her father collected on failed crops, and instead she found herself facing someone who, rather than pressed, who left doors open rather than closing them. There's a room down the hall set for you, he said, separate from mine. I didn't think it right, given the circumstances, to presume anything more than what's proper. He held her gaze a moment longer than the sentence required, and something passed through his expression too quick to name before he turned it away. You'll want rest and food once you're able. Mrs. from town's been by to help in the kitchen. I'll send her up. He left before she could answer, and lay back against the pillows and stared at the beamed ceiling and understood, with a kind of quiet horror, that she had just let a lie stand unchallenged for the second time in as many days. The days that followed took on a careful shape, like 2 people learning to walk around furniture in a dark room. Boone was courteous in a way that never quite became warm. He inquired after her health, saw that wood was split and stacked outside her door before the cold mornings, spoke to her at supper about the ranch, the cattle, the weather rolling down off the mountains, but never once reached across the table, literal or otherwise, to close the distance between them. Told herself this was a mercy. Some nights, lying alone in the narrow bed in her narrow room, she was less certain. She learned the house by inches. A portrait hung in the front room of a woman with Boone's same steady eyes, his mother, she guessed correctly, dead some years now. Her land still spoken of by the ranch hands in a tone reserved for something sacred and endangered both. There was talk, low and unfinished, of papers and boundary lines, and a debt collector out of the county seat who'd been circling the western pasture like a hawk waiting out a hard winter. And there was a chair at the end of the table that no one ever sat in, and a name, Daniel, that surfaced once in a ranch hand's careless sentence and then vanished, swallowed by a silence so immediate and so total that understood without being told, that she had brushed against a grief too raw for questions. It was at the church supper, held despite the lingering cold because the valley's women were not inclined to let weather dictate their calendar, that she first felt eyes on her that weren't kind. Wexford Hale was a tall man, well-dressed for the frontier, with the smooth manners of someone who had always gotten what he wanted and expected to go on doing so. He bowed over her hand a beat too long and studied her face with open calculation. He said, testing the name like a coin he suspected was counterfeit, "Funny, I always heard you described as dark-haired, and shorter if the letters were to be believed." He smiled, but it didn't reach anything behind his eyes. Memory plays tricks, I suppose, or letters do. Held his gaze and made herself smile back, made her voice light. "People rarely look the way they're described, Mr. Hale. I find it's usually for the better." He laughed, conceded the point with a small incline of his head, but she felt his attention linger on her the rest of the evening, weighing, measuring, filing something away for later use. That night cold seeped in around the window panes and went hunting through the hall closet for a spare blanket to keep it out. Her hand found a trunk instead, pushed back into shadow, its lid unlatched. Inside, tied with a strip of faded twine, lay a bundle of letters, the paper gone soft and yellow with handling, addressed in a woman's careful hand to Boone, and across the topmost page, in ink gone brown with age, a single half-visible line. The debt was torn to pieces the night your father. Footsteps sounded on the stairs behind her, unhurried, familiar, and closing fast. Didn't have time to close the trunk. Boone's shadow fell across the hallway floor before she could arrange her face into something innocent, and by the time he rounded the corner, she was still crouched there with the letters loose in her hand, caught as plainly as if she'd been reaching into his pocket. She braced for anger. She had seen her father angry, had seen what a man's temper looked like when he felt robbed of something private, and she flinched in anticipation of it. It didn't come. Boone stopped in the doorway, and what crossed his face instead was something closer to grief surfacing after a long time submerged, a slow, unguarded ache that made him look younger and more tired at once. He didn't reach for the letters. He didn't reach for her. He simply stood there a moment, looking at the bundle in her hands like it was a door he'd nailed shut years ago and had just watched swing open on its own. "You'll want to know what that says," he said finally, not a question. "I shouldn't have." "No, you shouldn't have, but you did, and I find I don't much mind." He came into the room slowly, lowered himself onto the edge of the trunk beside her, close enough that she caught the smell of wood smoke and cold night air still clinging to his shirt. "That debt you came here to settle, it isn't owed, hasn't been in 2 years." Went very still. "My father drank," Boone said, and the words came out flat, worn smooth from being turned over alone too many times. Not the kind of drinking men joke about in town. The kind that eats a house from the inside. He borrowed against everything he had trying to cover it, and when your father's debt came due, he was fixing to collect on it the way he collected on everything else by then, hard, and without a thought for who it cost. He turned one of the letters over in his fingers without reading it, as though he already knew every word by heart. "The night he died, I burned the note, tore it to pieces first, then burned what was left, out behind the smokehouse in the dark, so no one would ask me why I was crying over a piece of paper." "Why didn't you tell my father, tell anyone?" "Pride some, grief more." He looked at her then, and something in his gaze had gone unguarded in a way she hadn't seen since the gate. "And when the wedding date came round anyway, your father's letter arriving, everyone in the valley already expecting it, I told myself it didn't matter. That the marriage would happen regardless, debt or no debt, my father's old promise standing in for the paper I'd burned." A pause, longer this time. "Then I found you half dead in the snow, and some part of me went and decided I didn't want a reason for you to leave. So I let the town believe what it wanted to believe. Same as you did." The words landed somewhere beneath's ribs and stayed there, glowing like a coal. "I didn't want a reason for you to leave." It wasn't a declaration. Boone was not a man built for declarations. She understood that much of him already, but it was close enough to one that her breath caught on it. This was the moment. She felt it arrive the way she'd felt the storm coming days ago, some instinct ahead of conscious thought. Tell him. Tell him the debt was never yours to owe because you were never the sister meant to owe it. Tell him now, while his guard is down and his grief is out in the open, and the room is small and warm and honest. She opened her mouth. "Boone, there's something." A knock sounded below, hard and insistent, rattling the front door in its frame, and the moment broke apart like ice underfoot. It was one of the hands, breathless from the cold, hat still in his fist. "Rider come through town asking questions, mister, about the wedding, about your bride." He glanced at, uncertain, then back to Boone. "Fellow at the saloon saying he's kin to the, says there's a debt still owed him and he means to collect." Stomach dropped clean through the floor. Husband. Sam had run off with her sister 2 nights before the coach ever left, if he was here now, asking about debts he believed still stood. Then whatever trouble he'd carried into had followed them both, and it was arriving on Boone's doorstep wearing the wrong assumptions entirely. Boone's jaw tightened, some of the day's softness folding itself away behind the rancher's practiced calm. "Debt's settled, has been for 2 years." "He don't seem to know that, sir. Seems real determined otherwise." "Then I'll be the one to tell him." Boone rose, and for a moment his hand hovered near shoulder, not quite touching, a gesture offered and then withdrawn, as though he wasn't yet sure it was his to make. "Stay close to the house the next few days. I don't like a stranger riding and asking questions before he said a civil word to me first." She nodded, throat too tight to trust with speech, and watched him go, and understood that whatever chance she'd had to tell him the truth on her own terms had just ridden off into the dark alongside him. The days that followed drew tight as a snare. Wexford Hale, scenting blood the way certain men always could, made a show of concern that fooled no one who looked closely. He rode out twice under the pretense of neighborly duty, and both times caught him studying her face for cracks, listening for a slip in her voice, a detail out of place. He'd written letters of his own. She learned from Mrs. Careless gossip over the wash line letters to the county seat, to anyone who might know the family well enough to describe the sisters accurately. He was building something, patient and methodical and cruel in the unhurried way of a man who enjoyed the waiting as much as the collecting. And beneath all of it ran the current of what Boone had told her, turning over and over in her mind through sleepless nights. "I didn't want a reason for you to leave." She caught herself watching him across the supper table now with a different kind of attention. The set of his shoulders when he was tired, the particular quiet that came over him near the empty chair at the table's end, the way his hands, rough and sure with rope and rail, went unexpectedly gentle when he thought no one was looking. She was not falling for a stranger anymore. She was falling for a man she had begun, despite every reason not to know. Which made the lie sitting between them heavier with every day it went uncorrected. Not lighter, as she'd hoped, but heavier, the way snow builds weight on a roof beam until the whole structure groans beneath it. On the fifth evening, Mrs. came up from town with her basket and her news both, her face pale beneath her bonnet. "Riders in the saloon again," she said, setting the basket down with hands that trembled slightly. "Asking after the girl by name now, not's name, mind you, asking after." She looked up and something uneasy passed behind her eyes. "And out west, past the ridge, the sky's gone that same color it was the night the coach broke down." The storm arrived before midnight, and it arrived exactly as the first one had, a low moan building into a scream, the windows rattling in their frames, the whole valley disappearing behind a wall of driving white until the ranch house sat alone in the world, the way it had the night first walked into it under a name that wasn't hers. She was at the window when the shape appeared at the gate, not a rider this time but a man on foot, staggering, half frozen, pounding a fist against wood he could barely see. Boone was already moving before she'd finished drawing breath to call out, coat half on, lantern in hand, out into the screaming dark to drag the stranger in off the porch the same way he'd once dragged her in off the road. Sam collapsed just inside the door, snow melting off him in sheets, his eyes wild with cold and something closer to desperation. He looked up, searching the fire-lit room, and when his gaze found his whole face changed, confusion first, then a dawning, horrified recognition. "You're not," he stopped, shaking, whether from cold or shock she couldn't tell. "Your sister. What in God's name are you doing in's house?" The room went silent enough to hear the fire ticking in the grate. Boone's head turned slowly toward her, and watched something complicated move behind his eyes. Not yet anger, not yet betrayal, just the vast, unsteady work of a man rebuilding a floor that had just given way beneath him. "Somebody," he said, very quietly, "is going to tell me the truth in this house tonight, and I don't much care whose mouth it comes out of first." So told him. All of it, the letter sewn into her coat, the sister who'd run, the debt she'd never understood, the gate where a name not her own had been placed on her before she'd had the strength to refuse it, the days and weeks since where the lie had grown too large and too tangled to pull free of without tearing something irreplaceable down with it. Her voice shook through the whole of it, but she didn't look away from him, not once, because whatever came next, she owed him that much honesty at least. The door banged open again, before Boone could answer her. Wexford Hale came through it like a man who'd been waiting for exactly this moment to arrive, snow on his shoulders, satisfaction already settling into his face at the sight of Sam dripping on the floorboards. "Well," he said, drawing off his gloves finger by finger, unhurried, savoring it. "Seems the whole valley's about to learn what I've suspected since the church supper. The woman living under this roof as Boone's wife isn't who she claimed to be at all." He looked to with something like triumph. "I imagine that makes the marriage null, which makes the land and everything on it considerably easier to dispute." "The marriage stands," Boone said. His voice cut through the room clean and hard, and felt something in her chest crack open at the sound of it, not fear this time, but something closer to disbelief, hope arriving in a shape she hadn't let herself expect. "On what grounds?" Wexford's smile thinned. "The girl lied about her own name, stood at your gate and let the whole town call her by a name that wasn't hers. She stood at my gate half frozen, unable to speak her own name if she'd wanted to, and the town put words in her mouth before she'd so much as opened her eyes." Boone crossed the room and stopped beside, close enough that she felt the warmth of him like a windbreak against the storm still howling outside. "I've known for days there was more to her story than she was telling. Didn't take a genius to see it. She flinched every time someone called her, like the name cost her something to wear. I let it lie because I was a coward about what the truth might cost me, same as she was." He looked at now, and his voice gentled, though it lost none of its certainty. "But I'll say plain in front of every soul in this room that I know exactly who's standing beside me, her names, and I intend to keep her, debt or no debt, sister or no sister, if she'll have me." Wexford's jaw worked, calculation failing him for the first time since he'd walked through the door. He turned to Sam for support and found none. The man had gone gray with exhaustion, and the plain, deflating knowledge that whatever debt he'd ridden through a blizzard to collect had never existed in the first place. Whatever leverage Wexford had hoped to wield dissolved in his hands like snow against a warm palm, and after a long, bitter moment, he yanked his gloves back on and walked back out into the storm without another word, taking his ruined schemes with him. Sam left before dawn too, once the worst of the wind had broken, chastened and empty-handed, riding back toward whatever life he and had made for themselves out past the ridge. Watched him go from the window and felt, for the first time since the coach wheels first turned toward this valley, the strange lightness of having nothing left to hide. The house settled into a quiet unlike any it had held before, not the careful, guarded quiet of two strangers minding the distance between them, but something looser, something breathing. Boone found her in the kitchen near, the storm finally spent outside, sunlight breaking thin and pale across snow piled to the windowsills. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for every day I let you carry that alone. You carried your own truth alone for 2 years before I ever arrived," she said. "I don't think either of us owes the other much accounting for it now." He almost smiled at that, the first easy thing to cross his face in days, and held out his hand, not for anything practical, just to hold, and she took it. They walked out to the gate together that afternoon, the same gate where the town had once gathered with their lanterns and their relief, where a name not her own had settled onto her shoulders before she'd had the strength to shrug it off. The snow had gone soft and quiet, drifting down now instead of screaming, catching in Boone's dark hair and on the wool of her shawl. He stopped at the gatepost and looked at her a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she recognized now as the careful, unshowy way he arrived at anything that mattered to him. "You came here under a name that wasn't yours," he said, "under a debt that wasn't real, promised to a man you'd never met. You don't owe this valley anything more than you've already given it. If you wanted to go, truly go, start fresh somewhere no one's ever heard the name or both, I'd see you got there safe. Whoever marries you will be lucky. That much I've known since the night I found you in the snow. I won't stand in the way of it being someone who gets to start you off honest." She let the words settle, let the wind carry them out over the white fields where this had all begun, and then she turned back toward him instead of through the gate. "I was hopping," she said. "It would be you."